Somewhere in northern Minnesota in 1892, a camp cook put breakfast in front of 84 men every single morning, and the first plates went down at 3:30. Talking was forbidden while the food was on the table. That was the standing order. A man took his seat, cleared everything in front of him, and walked out into black timber with an axe. What that cook served sits at number 6 on this countdown. The item at number 17 packed such density that nutrition researchers today put one serving north of 1,400 calories. Number 3 involves a method so blunt and so efficient that it has disappeared entirely from the way Americans cook. None of these 25 breakfasts were built around flavor. Every one of them was built to keep a man breathing through the most lethal job on the continent. Tap subscribe. Here are the 25 punishing lumberjack breakfasts that timber crews genuinely put away before sunrise. Number 25. Coffee served out of a bucket. Nothing reached the table ahead of it. Forget a cup. Forget a pot. A bucket. 10-gallon kettles went on the stove, a fist of grounds tossed in for every gallon, then a hard rolling boil until what came out matched the shade of a creek bottom after heavy rain. There were cooks who dropped a whole raw egg into the kettle, shell included, to drag the grounds down. Others ground the shells up first, convinced the calcium knocked the edge off the bitterness. Crews joked that a mug of it would lift the finish clean off a saw handle. From 3 in the morning until the final man pushed back from the table, it kept simmering, turning darker and rougher with every passing hour. 15 cents bought a pound of arbuckles in the 1880s. A camp could go through 5 pounds between sunrises. Complaints about flavor never came up. You swallowed it because the alternative meant stepping into a frozen forest at 4 a.m. with nothing in you. This was never a drink. It was a condition of staying alive. Number 24. Salt pork with bread fried in the fat. Camps sitting too far out for the supply wagon to reach on schedule leaned on salt pork for everything they served, and morning was no exception. Out of the barrel came cured belly, sliced into heavy slabs, dropped into a cast iron pan wide as a wagon wheel. Whatever fat rendered out went right back to work, crisping torn hunks of raw dough until they swelled up brown at the edges. That bread pulled grease in like blotting paper. Men worked through it bare-handed, going back and forth between a chew of pork and a bite of fried dough. Greasy, heavily salted, and dense enough to sit on you until midday. In 1885, a barrel of salt pork ran near $12 and would carry 30 men for a fortnight. Subtlety played no part in this. The stuff landed on you the way a pine does when it comes down, which was precisely the intention. Number 23. Molasses over the whole table. Sugar, syrup, and dessert all lived in the same tacky black barrel, sitting in one corner of every cook shanty across the North Woods. It went over flapjacks, got stirred through oatmeal, ran across salt pork, and left the barrel by the spoonful whenever the cook's back was turned. Frontier prices put blackstrap around 30 cents a gallon, and it carried iron, calcium, and a jolt of fast energy that refined sugar never delivered. Camps through Wisconsin and Michigan drained the barrel weekly. A cook watched over it the way a barkeep watches his register, and a man who poured too freely caught a stare hard enough to split birch. Still, molasses was what made the sameness survivable. With every breakfast tasting like the last one, that dark sweetness was the single variable a man could control. Number 22. Oats boiled down. In the 1890s, $1 bought a 50-pound sack of rolled oats, enough to carry a crew close to a month. The routine started the previous evening. Oats went into an enormous pot of boiling water, cooked down to a heavy gray porridge, then got warmed through again ahead of dawn. Naked on the plate, it tasted like paste for hanging wallpaper. Hit it with molasses, drippings off the salt pork, or a pour of canned milk, and it turned into fuel. Starch that heavy released slowly, holding a man up through hour after hour of swinging steel in weather well below zero. Outfits operating in Maine and Minnesota wrote oats onto their requisition sheets by the ton rather than the sack. By the ton. A single Bemidji camp is said to have gone through 1,200 pounds across one winter. The men ate it with no pleasure and no grumbling, because grumbling about the food in a timber camp was a reliable way to stop receiving any. Number 21. Side meat fried with pan gravy. Side meat was bacon's cheaper, fatter relation, and it showed up as slabs the cook cut down every morning. Thick slices went flat onto the griddle and stayed there until the rims went crisp and the rendered fat lay deep enough to cook in. Meat came off, flour went in, and it got beaten through the hot grease until the color turned. A splash of water, or coffee if that was closer, finished it into a coarse gravy. That gravy landed on biscuits, on bread, on anything with a surface. 8 cents a pound was the going rate through the 1880s, near enough to half of what proper bacon cost. It tasted denser and greasier, missing entirely the sweet note that sugar curing gave. Not one man in the camp minded. Grease meant calories. Every drop of it was another reason a man stayed vertical in a blizzard. A camp cook measured his own work against exactly one question. Could somebody eat this and still be upright 12 hours later? Side meat and gravy answered yes each morning without fail. Number 20. Dried apples stewed soft. They came in on burlap, wrinkled and tough as leather, still carrying a faint smell of orchards in October. Overnight, the cook let them simmer in water with a scoop of molasses or sugar until they slumped into a heavy, sweet compote that sat steaming in iron pots when the men arrived. Where nothing fresh appeared from October through April, that pot was all that stood between a crew and scurvy. 10 cents covered a pound of dried apples, and a pound swelled toward 3 once it took on water. Men laid them beside flapjacks, ladled them onto oatmeal, or just went at the pot directly with a torn piece of bread. That tartness sliced through the fat of everything else in front of them. In an endless procession of pork, dough, and coffee, this was as near to tenderness as the morning ever came. Number 19. Beans out of the bean hole. Certain camps buried their beans to cook them. A pit got dug, hardwood burned down inside it for hours, and once the coals settled, a cast iron Dutch oven went in loaded with navy beans, molasses, mustard, and a slab of salt pork. Dirt sealed the top, and it stayed there through the night. Come 3 in the morning, those beans had spent 10 or 12 hours in captured heat, gone creamy and near black and thick with smoke, with nobody standing over them. The method traces back to indigenous practice, and settlers out of New England hauled it directly into northeastern timber country. Around $3 bought 100 pounds of dried navy beans in the 1880s. They turned up at breakfast as readily as at supper for one reason: they were finished whether or not the cook was. The pot held its own heat and demanded nothing from anybody. When you are feeding 60 men before the sun comes up, that self-sufficiency beats flavor every time. Number 18. Sourdough hotcakes piled up. First pattern break. This is the point where it gets serious. Flapjacks ruled the timber camp morning, and the starter crock was the crown on the head. Every cook kept a living culture going, a bubbling slurry of wild yeast, flour, and water that he defended like his own child. Up through northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, cooks took the crock to bed with them so the cold would not kill it overnight. Lose the starter, and you lose flapjacks. Lose flapjacks, and you are one bad morning from mutiny. Before daylight, he pulled a portion, worked in flour, eggs when the wagon had brought some, a pinch of saleratus to lift them, and ladled rounds the width of dinner plates onto greased iron. One man might put away 10 or 15 at a sitting, stacked and swimming in molasses or cane syrup. Weyerhaeuser camp records out of the 1890s show a cook turning out better than 500 in a morning for 50 men. What sourdough gave them was a tang no packaged yeast has ever copied, a sourness running underneath the sweet that pushed a man toward one more. Those cultures moved between camps and across seasons, some of them alive for decades. A retiring cook handed his crock to the next man, the way a father hands down a watch. Nothing else in that kitchen was worth as much. Number 17. Donuts fried by the crate. What a logging camp called a donut bore no resemblance to the glazed ring in a bakery window. It was a knot of sweet dough the size of a fist, dropped into a kettle of rolling lard and left until it came up deep mahogany and burst along the seam. Cooks turned them out in the hundreds. One of them, fried in lard, ran past 400 calories on its own. Men lifted 3 or 4 off the pile and buried them in coat pockets for the hike out to the cut, then pulled them apart mid-morning once the cold had eaten through breakfast. Look at the arithmetic. 4 of those before daylight put more than 1,400 calories into a man before his axe left the rack. Timber outfits never read that as waste. They read it as cheap energy. Flour, sugar, lard, eggs. Nothing else on the wagon came cheaper, and what came back was a crew capable of dropping 200 trees by noon. A dietitian now would call it reckless. The men calling for seconds called it Tuesday. Number 16. Hash from corned beef. Canned corned beef reached most camps by the 1880s, and where it did, the cook minced it small with boiled potato and onion, pressed the whole mass flat against a screaming hot skillet, and refused to touch it until a dark crust set underneath, flipping it across in slabs. That crust justified the entire dish. Caramelized meat and starch fused into something like a savory pancake, carrying a depth that plain boiled potato could never reach. 20 cents got you a tin. 2 tins plus a pail of potatoes covered 30 men. It sat warm and low in the stomach, letting the energy out slowly as the morning wore on. Where beef arrived fresh only if a wagon punched through, that tin was the dependable thing keeping breakfast from shrinking to bread and coffee alone. A cook with a reputation for the crust carried it from outfit to outfit like a written reference. Number 15. Johnny cake. Thin cornmeal batter went onto greased iron and cooked until the rims went brown and lacy. They came off faster than flapjacks, cost less than biscuits, and held together well enough to ride in a coat pocket all morning. The name probably wandered over from journey cake, the sort of bread you carried on the road. Through the upper Midwest and across New England, cornmeal ran to roughly half what wheat flour did, and any cook watching his ledger reached for it wherever he could. The result was dense, faintly gritty, and sweeter than wheat bread ever manages. Men snapped them in half and dragged the pieces through bean liquor, through gravy, through whatever was pooling on the plate. Pure utility food, shaped to work rather than to impress. Number 14. Head cheese. This one turns stomachs now, but no part of a butchered hog was allowed to go to waste in a timber camp. A pig's head, feet occasionally included, went into the pot for hours until the meat surrendered off the bone and the liquid thickened with its own gelatin. The cook picked through it, hit it with vinegar, sage, salt, and pepper, packed the meat into a pan, poured the broth back over the top, and set it out in the cold to firm up overnight. By breakfast, it cut clean and behaved on the plate like a cold cut. Men ate it over bread or straight off the plate with a fork. Almost nothing was charged for a hog's head, since nobody else had any use for it. The camp cook had a use for it. 20 men fed across 2 mornings from something the butcher would practically hand over. Rich, unmistakably porky, with a sour edge left by the vinegar. Honest food, off an honest animal, made by men to whom waste was a sin they simply could not pay for. Number 13. Potatoes fried by the bushel. The potato was the one vegetable that came through the haul to a remote camp still intact. It arrived by the wagon load, went into root cellars cut down into frozen earth, and showed up in the morning in thick slices cooked in whatever fat was on hand. A bushel went for roughly 40 cents through the 1880s. The cook laid them into the skillet ahead of everything else, letting them go tender in pork fat while he built the rest of the meal around them. By the time the benches filled, those slices had crisped into gold, salt-crusted planks that cracked under a tooth and then dissolved. Salt and nothing else. Patience and no other technique. Of everything laid out on that table, the potatoes were the one item that put a man back in a home kitchen, back in his mother's doorway, back on the farm he had left to chase a winter wage in the pines. Number 12. The red flannel hash. This is the second pattern break. A dish assembled out of scraps and sheer stubbornness. The name came off the beets, which stained everything they touched a deep crimson. Boiled beets left from supper, along with potato, onion, and whatever meat had survived the night, got chopped together and driven hard across a skillet until its underside went nearly black with caramelization. The beets bled through the potato and the meat until the whole pan matched the color of a lumberjack's winter underwear. Earthy on the tongue, sweet where the beets sat, savory from the meat, smoky off the iron. Camps through Vermont and New Hampshire built it constantly, since beets kept through the winter as well as potatoes did and came in at almost no cost. A bushel ran about 30 cents. Outsiders found the sight alarming, a plate full of crimson mush, but the men eating it understood the beets were delivering iron and vitamins their diet was badly short of. Every forkful was nutrition wearing the disguise of leftovers. Number 11. PEA soup you could stand a spoon in. Split peas went into the back of the cook stove overnight with a ham bone or a slab of salt pork and stayed there until they broke down entirely into a heavy, pale green mash. By morning, what had started as soup had cooked toward pudding. The cook filled bowls, and the men worked through it with bread, doing double duty as spoon and plate. $2.50 bought 50 pounds of dried peas, and 50 pounds went a long way. What came out of the pot was protein, fiber, and a heat that started behind the ribs and pushed outward into frozen hands and feet. Through the French-Canadian camps of Quebec and northern Maine, this was the breakfast the whole culture rested on. Cooks knew it as soupe au pois, and no two of them built it identically, a little savory in one pot, a bay leaf in the next, but the base never moved. Peas, pork, thyme, water. Number 10. Eggs arriving by the case. On the mornings a supply wagon showed up carrying eggs, the cook worked like it was Christmas. They went into skillets broad as shields a dozen at a time, frying in standing lard until the whites firmed and the yolks stayed loose enough to run into bread. A case, 30 dozen of them, cost roughly $4 during the 1890s and might see a big camp through 2 mornings. Men who had gone weeks without one ate quietly, almost respectfully, chasing the last streak of yolk around the plate with whatever bread was in reach. Eggs were the luxury on that table, arriving often enough to remind a crew what real food was, and vanishing fast enough that they felt the absence. Number 9. Venison steaks before daylight. Where the supply line ran thin, the rifle filled the gap. When somebody dropped a deer, the cook cut the backstrap into heavy steaks and put them across high heat in the dark before dawn. Lean meat, loaded with iron, tasting of the exact woods those men were headed out to level. It arrived with no ceremony attached to it whatsoever. It was simply what the camp had, cooked fast, set out next to everything else already going. Whoever had made the kill the previous day ate with a specific kind of pride, knowing his work was on every plate. Journals kept in Michigan's Upper Peninsula log deer, accounting for as much as a third of a camp's protein across a winter. Nobody used the phrase farm to table. They used the word eating. Number 8. Biscuits by the panful. A competent camp cook had 200 biscuits out of the oven before most of his crew had their eyes open. Lard, flour, salt, baking powder, and buttermilk when there was any, water when there was not, mixed in a hurry and stamped into rounds with the lip of a tin cup, then run through sheet pans in a cast iron stove until they came up tall and browned. Third pattern break. That biscuit served as the all-purpose tool of a timber camp morning. It hauled gravy, drank bean liquor, held a slice of fried meat, and stood in for a spoon whenever a man's hands were too frozen or too torn up for real cutlery. A 100-pound barrel of flour cost around $4 in the 1880s, and one skilled cook could pull better than 1,000 biscuits out of it. The arithmetic mattered, because logging companies tracked what they spent feeding a man per day as closely as they tracked board feet cut per acre. Producing a biscuit cost a sliver of a cent. The work that biscuit paid for was measured in dollars. That ratio is what kept camp stoves lit 7 days a week from freeze to thaw. Number 7. Blood sausage. The morning after hogs were butchered, blood sausage was on the table. Fresh blood got worked together with oats, chopped onion, salt, and spice, forced into cleaned casings, and poached until the links set. Cut thick and fried until the skin snapped, it handed over a mineral-heavy, intensely savory protein to Scandinavian and German loggers who had eaten the same thing since boyhood back home. Finns working the Minnesota woods called the pancake version veriohukainen. The Irish called their version black pudding. Different names, identical logic. Blood carried too much nourishment to be spilled onto the dirt. One hog supplied enough for several mornings running. The flavor was earthy, edging toward metallic, with a depth that ordinary sausage cannot get near. Men either looked forward to it or got through it. Either way, the plate came back empty. Number 6. The full camp spread. This is the breakfast that Minnesota cook laid down for 84 silent men every morning. It was never one dish. It was a production. The table, a plank run sometimes 40 feet end to end, was covered before anybody walked in. Stacks of flapjacks, fried salt pork, boiled potatoes, baked beans, biscuits, donuts, stewed fruit, molasses, oatmeal, coffee. Everything at the same time. Everything taken for granted. Men dropped onto the benches, ate without a word as camp rules required, and were out the door inside a quarter hour. Silence was enforced because conversation slowed the eating, and slow eating held up the cut. The cook and the boys working under him, known as cookies, had been on their feet since 2 in the morning, assembling this stockpile of calories. Feeding 80 men one breakfast burned through something like 50 pounds of flour, 20 of pork, 10 of beans, and 5 gallons of coffee. Companies figured the cost at 15 to 20 cents a man per sitting and paid it without a word of protest, because a fed crew cut more timber than a starving one, and a starving crew simply walked. Number 5. Smoked pork chops. Camps with a smokehouse cured and smoked chops in batches meant to carry them through the hardest stretch of winter. The cook took them off the hanging rack and seared them quickly on the griddle, driving the smoke deeper as it met hot iron. They came away faintly pink at the center, the edges gone dark and salty, throwing off a smell that cut clean through the wood smoke and pine pitch soaked into every hour of that life. A smoked chop sat a clear step above the daily salt pork, a modest upgrade, but one that told the crew the camp was properly stocked, and the foreman understood how to keep men content. A whole hog bought off a neighboring farmer ran about $5 in the 1880s, and smoked then rationed with care, it spread across weeks of mornings. Every chop said somebody in the operation had thought ahead. Number 4. Bean sandwiches. Cold baked beans left from supper, laid thick between 2 cut slabs of bread, wrapped in cloth, shoved into a coat pocket. Nobody sat down for this one. This was what a man ate on the walk out to the cut in the dark, biting off corners with one hand while the other carried a lantern or caught him on the ice. Inside a few minutes, the beans went nearly solid in the cold, so men pushed the bundle in under their shirts against bare skin to keep it soft enough to chew. This was the Northwoods travel breakfast, designed around motion instead of comfort. Protein, starch, and fat arrived together in one parcel, needing no plate, no fork, and no time at all. The cook built them by the dozen, folded everyone identically, and set them in a row on the table by the door so a man could take one without slowing down. Number 3. Stew served at breakfast. Here is the vanished technique. Where a cook had to push the maximum number of calories into the shortest possible window, He took whatever meat existed, diced it fine, browned it hard, then dropped potatoes, onions, turnips, and water into the same pot, and boiled it all into a thick, starch-heavy stew that hit the table at 4 in the morning. Not at noon. Not at supper. At breakfast. It had been going since midnight, meat collapsing off itself, vegetables melting into a broth that hung on the ladle. Men took 2 bowls, 3 sometimes, mopped the bottom with bread, and carried enough in them to work a saw for 6 unbroken hours before the midday meal came up on a sled. No American eats stew at daybreak now. It reads as wrong, close to a violation. But when a man is burning between 7,000 and 9,000 calories daily at 30 below, sorting food into morning food and evening food is a luxury he cannot pay for. They ate what produced strength. Stew produced strength. Number 2. The pork and pancake stack. Not pork sitting next to pancakes. Pork built into pancakes, flapjacks, and fried salt pork, alternating 5 or 6 tiers up, flooded with molasses, and attacked with fork and knife like some savory cake. What that structure delivered was an almost indecent concentration of fat, starch, and sugar, engineered vertically, enough to carry a 200-pound man through a morning hauling a crosscut through frozen white pine. Certain camps called it a lumber pile. Others called it a shanty stack. Nobody cared about the name. What counted was that the thing did its job. A man who put away a full stack at 4 a.m. was still on his feet at noon. A man who skipped it was not. Whoever first assembled this understood something modern nutrition has spent decades making complicated. Hard work wants hard food, plain as a tree on the ground. Number 1. Flapjacks and everything else. The breakfast that came to define the whole era was never one dish. It was a posture. Flapjacks laid down as the floor, then every calorie within arm's reach heaped around and on top of them. Pork, beans, potatoes, donuts, eggs on the rare mornings they existed, gravy, molasses, coffee stiff enough to raise the dead. The cook never asked anybody's preference. He set the whole of it out and let each man assemble his own meal from the pile. This is what powered the industry that raised American cities. The lumber that framed houses in Detroit, Chicago, and Minneapolis came down under men who ate like this before daylight, without speaking, inside camps that stank of pine resin, lard, coffee, and wet wool. Every board foot that moved across the Great Lakes got paid for twice, once in currency and once in flapjacks. Those men are gone now. So are the forests they took down. But the breakfast is still here, sitting in photographs, in journals, and in the thinning memories of families who go on telling the stories. So here is what I am asking you to do. Cook one of them this week. The Dutch oven beans, the sourdough hot cakes, the corned beef hash, and get that crust right. Then sit down with it before the sun is up and find out whether it changes the shape of your morning. Tell me in the comments. I want to see whether the pork and pancake stack pulls more votes than the beanhole beans. Because none of this was ever only breakfast. It was the fuel that built a country, one tree at a time.